Okay. Hey everyone, welcome to Bumbling Through Dungeons. My name's Mark. Today we are talking about. Where did I put the book? I should have had it in front of me. We are talking about. Boom! That's the monster manual. We're not talking about the monster manual. Hang on. Boom. Out of the Abyss. Hello everyone, welcome to the third installment of a deep dive sort of review slash how I would run it video about one of the 5th edition adventures. The first two we did were Dragon Heist and Curse of Straw. The third is going to be Out of the Abyss. And I'm not going to do one of these for every single one because I haven't played through every single one in a group or used it enough as a DM to be able to talk in depth about it for this long. But the ones where I've really spent a lot of time with, I want to sort of dig into it a little bit more to see what's really good about it, what's not so great about it maybe, and some ways that you can turn it into a really interesting adventure at your table. So Out of the Abyss is a level 1 to 15 adventure that takes place. Hang on, one of the neighbors is looking at me from across the street. I'm gonna go close my blinds. Okay, we're back, and the neighbors can no longer see me talking into a camera. Where were we? Ah, yes. Out of the Abyss, 1 to 15 adventure takes place almost entirely in the confines of the Underdark, the subterranean area that exists beneath the prime material plains, main, overland, Faerunian, whatever the heck, I lost my train of thought there. And of course, as with the other two deep dives that we did, I hope it goes without saying that there are going to be some massive spoilers in this video. So if you don't want to be spoiled for Out of the Abyss, please stop watching now. And it's really split into two different sections. The first is going to cover roughly levels like 1 to 7, and that is the adventure starts out where you are prisoners of the Drow, and you have to escape, and then you make your way through the Underdark, meeting different NPCs and going to different locations and trying to escape, get out of the abyss that is the Underdark. So that's the first part of it, and you're learning a little bit about what's going on in the Underdark during all of this. So you're setting up what's going to happen in the second half. And during this whole first half, the Drow are in pursuit of you. So they've lost you, they're trying to get you back, and this is something that supposedly drives the plot forward in different sections throughout this first half. So then once you escape the Underdark, you spend a little bit of time overland, and then you're called back to Gauntlgrim at the behest of King Brunor of Gauntlgrim to discuss what you learned when you were in the Underdark, and you're asked to go back down into the Underdark and lead a force against the Demon Lords. So you will have come into contact with these Demon Lords in the first half, and you will have seen their influence in the various towns and cities and locations that you go to, and these abyssal Demon Lords are starting to literally come into the abyss, or I'm sorry, come into the Underdark, and their influence is being shown in a variety of demonic ways. So in the second half, you're leading this expeditionary war force into the Underdark to try to take on the Demon Lords, and what ends up happening is you're going to hit a few locations that you have either heard about previously or learn about on your return venture into the Underdark, and then you'll end up going on an elaborate fetch quest to get a number of different items to put together a ritual that will summon all of the Demon Lords to a single location in order for them to battle to the death. And there are different ways that this could play out, but essentially this is going to end the Demon Lord incursion one way or another. And there are a host of subplots and side quests and things like that, but that is the main thrust of the adventure. So when I ran parts of Out of the Abyss, I'm not going to say I ran Out of the Abyss, I was running a homebrew campaign, and my players were about to head to Gauntlgrim, and I said, I need a campaign arc for them to be a part of. And so I ended up adapting large chunks of Out of the Abyss into my homebrew setting. That included the presence of the Demon Lords in the Underdark, and they ended up having to find a way to send the Demon Lords back into the Abyss. It played out quite a bit differently than Out of the Abyss by the very end. They ended up back in Waterdeep, the city of Waterdeep, where the campaign had started, but they spent 10 to 12 sessions down in the Underdark, hitting different locations and also following some plot hooks that I pulled directly from Out of the Abyss, and that included NPCs, locations, details, encounters, entire encounter chains. And there was a lot for me to play with, and it was basically an adaptation of Out of the Abyss for part of this homebrew campaign that I was running. So in order to do this, I had to go through the entire book and see what parts I wanted to keep, what parts I didn't want to keep, and what I wanted to adapt into my particular story. This made for an interesting read through because unlike some others, I wasn't trying to run it as written. I knew for a fact going in that I was only going to be taking parts of it. And so I was looking for those things that could exist outside the main plot of Out of the Abyss. They weren't Prisoners of the Drow. There wasn't even a Drow pursuit sub-story to the early portions. They were, I think, level 5 by the time they got to Gauntlgrim and the Underdark. And so I basically got rid of that whole subplot where they're being chased by the Drow. But a lot of things that happen in a lot of the cities and towns and locations that they go to during those early parts of Out of the Abyss, I absolutely did include. So in this first section, what things do I like? What things don't I like? Well, the first thing, and a lot of DMs have commented on this when they're running it, is when you start as Prisoners of the Drow, you are fellow prisoners with a number of different NPCs, and there are a lot of NPCs in this early portion. And the reason for that is many of them are linked to one or more locations in the Underdark, and so through these NPCs you have plot hooks that will take you to the locations, and you will have some information about these locations. So this is the way that the designers decided to get that information to the players, was through these NPCs. The issue is that there are a lot of NPCs to juggle, and one, that can be very difficult for a DM, and two, that's a lot of screen time, to put it in movie terms, for characters who aren't the PCs, who aren't your players, and so it can sometimes take the spotlight away from the players, which is kind of what we always want to be doing, is keeping the spotlight on the players. So I've seen many DMs who say, well, I got rid of half of these NPCs, or I found ways to get rid of them early, or I found other ways to work in the information that they had and the plot hooks that they had, or maybe they just ignored a third of the plot hooks and NPCs and ran with the ones that they thought were going to be more interesting. And I think any of those are valid decisions here. I think probably the hardest way to run it would be to try to incorporate all of them, because it's a lot of choice from the very beginning, and it's a lot of different personalities and motivations to have to consider all at once. And I'm not sure that there's going to be too many DMs, myself included, who could run that in a way where the first few sessions feel like they flow well. Now, what I do like about this early section is a lot of the locations that you're going to go to, and a lot of the creatures and NPCs that you're going to encounter, and a lot of the really side quests that you're going to end up having to juggle or deal with, or the players will have to decide on in each of these locations. One of the more interesting to me is Gracklestugh, the city of the Duergar, the Grey Dwarves. And there is so much. Gracklestugh is a huge chapter in this book. And there's a whole lot that the PCs can get involved with in Gracklestugh that doesn't necessarily have to do with the main plot. And this, for some DMs, they'll want to kind of stay on script and keep things moving, so they'll get rid of a lot of this. But others, I've heard of other groups that have spent 10 sessions alone inside Gracklestugh, getting into the politics and interacting with the ruler, or maybe overthrowing the ruler, or playing the different factions within Gracklestugh against one another. There's a dragon, and there's Darrow, and there's the Duergar, and there's a lot of different motivations going on here. And so this is a large city that you can spend a lot of time in, outside of that main plot that I mentioned. But a lot of these locations are very fleshed out, they're very brought to life, they feel very real, they feel very alive. Another is Blingdenstone with the deep gnomes. That's another one that I really like. I took some encounters straight from there with the Pudding King, who is a deep gnome who is under the influence of Dweeblex or Jubilex. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that demon lord's name, but I think it's Dweeblex, and he's under the influence of Dweeblex, and there's a whole encounter chain surrounding this Pudding King, which is really just a funny name for a villain. So then you're forming alliances, you're making allies, you're doing fun things, you're investigating things, you're probably getting a bunch of magic items, and I think there are a lot of really interesting locations in this first part that are going to allow the players to really sink into the setting of the Underdark. And that is another thing that I think the book does really well, is it brings the Underdark alive. Sometimes when we think of the Underdark, we just think of like dank, dark caverns and darkness and oppression and the feeling that you're caved in at all times. And this can be somewhat claustrophobic, both literally and metaphorically, for players unless you have some interesting things going on in the Underdark. And this book has that in spades. So I think in the preface to the book, they invoke Alice in Wonderland and wanting it to feel like you are entering a brand new world when you go into the Underdark. And it very much does feel that way. And there are places that feel much more alive than you might initially assume when you go to them in the Underdark. Neverlight Grove is one that I'm thinking of, and that is where the Myconids, the mushroom people, for lack of a better term, they live. And there's actually one of the demon lords there who's inserting her influence. Zugtomoy, they all have weird names, but so this demon lord is actually in Neverlight Grove. So there's a lot of interesting things to play off of there because some of that dark influence is starting to hold sway over some of the Myconids who are otherwise very peace-loving. But when you enter the Neverlight Grove, the different things going on there and the way they describe the area, it does feel like almost like an alien world. And it's very different from anywhere else you're going to go in the Underdark, and what some players and some DMs might imagine the Underdark is like. So I think the Myconids are very much brought to life. I think a lot of these, the Duergar, the Deep Gnomes I've mentioned, the Kuatoa, Ian Sloobludop, a lot of weird names in this book. Sloobludop is I think that's the name of their town. It's right on the edge of a big underground lake. And so there are a lot of interesting, I don't want to call them factions, but races, factions, cities in which to interact. And of course, there are other creatures other than Duergar inside Gracklestug. There are other creatures other than Deep Gnomes inside Blingdenstone. So there's a lot of interesting ways that some of these Underdark tensions can come to life. And I mentioned the Myconids, and one of the things that I did when my players were in the Underdark is they had a Myconid companion. That was one of the NPCs that I kept. And so there was this Myconid following them around, and they really enjoyed their Myconid companion. And he was very peace-loving and very happy and very helpful. And one of the things that he did was he would show them the different types of funguses and mushrooms in the Underdark that could be used for different things. Could it be used for a poison? Could it be used to heal? Could it be used to eat? Could it be used for shelter? Could you make a boat out of certain ones, out of larger ones where it was so dense that it was almost like wood? And this was a way that I was able to make the Underdark seem very different and add some nuance to it, give it some flavor that wasn't necessarily related to the main plot, but give them some things to look for and interact with and use while they were down there that they were never going to find above ground. Because the demon lords are very madness inducing, there are also madness tables to navigate in this. And I didn't use those so much. I think once or twice I had some short-term madness when something bad happened to my players. But if you're going to spend the whole 1 to 15 adventure down there, you're probably going to have to grapple with this at some point. And one or more of your players might end up with an indefinite form of madness. And this can be very interesting, and it can sometimes be character breaking if you're not careful with how you handle it. So I think that there are different ways that have been discussed online that I've seen about how to handle it, and then some DMs have used different madness charts that they've pulled, or they'll just look at the madness charts and say, okay, which ones do I think make the most sense? And then they take the one or two, rather than rolling randomly to see which madness their players get. They just pick the ones that they think are going to make the most sense, or the ones that they think will be most interesting narratively. So that's all really good in the first half. The one thing that I'm not a huge fan of overarching with this first half is the actual escape from the Drow meta plot, because they're hopping between these different locations and the Drow are ostensibly following them this entire time or trying to learn their whereabouts and then follow up with that and recapture them so that they become prisoners of the Drow again. And this first half can drag on for quite a while to the point where it can be very hard to make that pursuit of the Drow seem believable and seem like it's an imminent threat. So I think I'd handle this one of two different ways. The first is that I would ignore it almost entirely, or once they escape from the Drow, I wouldn't have that pursuit be real and present. Maybe if they come into contact with some Drow, it starts up again. But for the most part, I would just have them sort of exploring and trying to find their way to the surface world, and not necessarily, I would put other hurdles in their way and other things to push them along from one location to the next, not necessarily this Drow pursuit. The second way I think you could handle it is to go the opposite direction, the complete opposite direction, and make it always present. Always have some reminder in any location they go to that the drow know they escaped from them and they want them back. They want to bring them back into slavery. And I think that that will give an omnipresent threat to push the players along their journey and move the action along. But that'll require a lot more work to find believable ways that the drow could have influence in each of these locations. The other thing that I would abstract out a little bit is travel. So the Underdark is a very large place, and this campaign, regardless of how you run it, is going to take place over the period of months in game, if not years, probably months. I don't think it would take that long as years, but it is going to be a protracted campaign, and some of the travel between places is such that it's going to be a long journey. There's going to be a lot of random encounters. There's going to be a lot of downtime. I would abstract a lot of that travel. So say when they are on the Dark Lake, which is the large underground lake that connects a lot of these locations that they'll be going to, that I would make it so that the locations are closer together, or that we just sort of hand wave over travel sometimes. So I wouldn't roll for random encounters quite as often as the book suggests, and I think eventually that could get a little bit tired, and that is the one way that it can start to seem a little bit like a slog, rather than getting the players to these interesting locations that they have set up around the Dark Lake and in other adjacent areas in the Underdark. So that takes us through the first half. The second half, again, sees them heading back to Gauntlgrim to talk to King Brunor and a council who is really concerned about the return of the demon lords, and it's causing trouble for the surface world, and everyone's going to be affected, and something needs to be done, and the PCs, of course, are at the center of it all. This is also an opportunity, if you use the factions in 5th edition, for factions to have certain agendas that they talk to the players about when they go into the Underdark, so that they have side quests going on along with the main quest. That could be interesting for some groups. I think probably I would ignore that for the most part, because I think these larger adventures are more about the adventure itself, not about those faction things. Factions really come much more into play when you talk about, say, Adventurers League play. Many of the Adventurers League stories run parallel to these adventures, and those can be really interesting if you're playing through both. So if you do have players that are involved with the factions and do a lot of Adventurers League stuff, then I would absolutely include it. But for a group who isn't necessarily familiar with that and doesn't necessarily have any faction allegiances, then I would probably ignore that part. And in this second half, most groups are going to follow a path that takes them to Mantle Dareth, which is kind of the Switzerland of the Underdark, where a lot of different races live together in sort of a trading hub. And then from Mantle Dareth, they're going to go to Graven Hollow, which is this ancient library of the Underdark. It's kind of like the Candlekeep of the Underdark for lore people who know what Candlekeep is up on the surface world. And then from Graven Hollow, they're going to end up at the Tower of a Drow Wizard, who's going to send them on the chain of quests that will put together this ritual to summon the demon lords and end the incursion. There are probably other ways that you can handle it and other ways that it's played out with certain groups, but that seems to be the progression, and then it goes back into a little bit of a sandbox once you are at the fetch quest portion, because there are different places that you could go in different orders. So I really like Mantle Dareth. When I used it in my game, I actually didn't have a demon lord there, so I didn't have a whole lot of conflict between the demon lords, because I actually thought it was quite interesting that it was this sort of trade hub where a lot of different races came together in the Underdark. I thought there was enough to play off of there to make for some interesting plot hooks, and my players ended up going back and forth to Mantle Dareth quite a bit, because I made it sort of the hub of all the different stops in the Underdark. So they would stop back there to talk with their allies or contacts, or figure out where they were going to go next, or if they had rescued somebody, they'd take them back there because that was sort of a safe place. And so it made for a very interesting, not home base in the Underdark, but certainly closer to a home base than some of the other cities and locations. And Graven Hollow I find very, very interesting. So the path to Graven Hollow in this whole section has a handful of random encounters. There's one with a beholder. There's one that involves some purple worm eggs that I think are very interesting and that I would try to include in interesting ways. There's a network of webbing in a giant cavern underground that I adapted into my campaign. And so you're walking on literal web bridges in this cavern, and you can just imagine the sort of complications and encounters that you can have in a setting such as that. So again, I think some of the ideas and encounters are super cool in this book, and I think that's its strength. I think that's the highlight of this book, is that you're going to find any DM who reads through this is going to find a handful of encounters, a handful of NPCs, plot hooks, locations that they just find really, really interesting, and they're going to be able to bring to life in some great ways. Graven Hollow is another one of those, and I actually think there's some untapped potential in Graven Hollow. So Graven Hollow, you head into, and then you're looking for information about the Underdark that's going to help you against the Demon Lord incursion. And while you're there, you have the opportunity to speak with the ghosts of from the past, from the present, from the future, of very interesting or prominent figures in the Forgotten Realms. So it suggests about half a dozen or so of these figures and says it might be from the past, it might be from the future, and here's some of the things that they say to the players. And this is all very interesting, it's very evocative, but I think there's an opportunity here, and I want to tell you how I used Graven Hollow, because I think it was a really interesting way to get the characters involved personally in what was going on. So when my characters went into Graven Hollow, their guide in Graven Hollow told them, all right, ask a question that you're searching for the answer to. If it's about the Underdark, you have a better chance of finding specific information. And then simply go into the library and start looking, and the library will guide you to what you need to know. So they started to do this, and they all went off in their separate directions, and they did find some information, and some of the information that they found was related to the question that they asked, and then other information that they found was related to other things that I wanted them to know, either about the overarching quest or about their characters personally. So here's where I got to pull some information from their backstory and give them some information that they weren't expecting. Second, the ghosts that they encountered. Again, either from the past, the present, the future, they didn't exactly know when these ghosts were from, but these ghosts weren't famous figures from the Forgotten Realms. Instead, oftentimes, these were figures tied to their personal story. So in one case, one of the characters, it was his father who appeared to him, but his father was much older than the character knew he should have been. So he figured out that it was his father from some future time, and he actually had a conversation with his dad. Now, he and his dad, within his character's backstory, were not on speaking terms. So this was a very tense conversation, but he got a lot of interesting information out of it. Others got weird cryptic messages that they weren't sure how to interpret, that either did or didn't come true later on, or may have had something to do with a future plot hook or a future setting that I could incorporate later if I wanted to. So there was a lot of information that I fed the players here, and how I handled it was I sent all of them but one out of the room, and I had a one-on-one with their ghost talk, and then that player would leave and the next one would come in, and I would do that again. I don't think this is good to do too often, but here I thought it worked really well, because then the players were all like, what did he tell you? What did he tell you? And they were really interested to see what information only they had gotten. So this, I think, is a really great way you can use Graven Hollow. And I think some of those ideas are there in the book, but to really get the most out of it, I think you're going to have to pull a little bit more out and add some ideas in of your own. So then once you talk to the Drow Wizard who sends you off on the fetch quest, and you are collecting these things for the ritual, I think this is all handled okay. I think there are some subplots and side quests that I'm not a huge fan of, and others that I really am, that I would start to incorporate here. So I would mix and match a lot of the plot hooks and locations and settings in order to create the quest chain that I thought was most interesting. For example, there is a side plot involving a wedding between a large fungal growth that is sentient and Zugtamoy, the Lady of Rot, who's like the Mushroom Queen Demon Lord. I'm not quite sure what to call her exactly, but it involves Dweeblex, and it involves those two entities, and I'm not a huge fan of it, to be perfectly honest with you. So I might ignore some of that and create something new in its place if the players are having to search for something near where that's going on. But then some of the interesting side encounters that you can include, like the ones I mentioned earlier with the web bridges, or the ones with the beholder, the beholder one that I really like. There's the Zazax the Eyemonger is his name, and he collects eye stalks of different beholders. So he has a bunch that are just inert and that are grafted onto his skin. I think that's a really interesting concept for a beholder. So these are things that I would absolutely seed into the adventure in different ways, either as you have to get the item for the ritual in this place from the beholder, maybe, or from this cavern with all the web bridges and who knows what other horrors in it, or at least that's something that they have to navigate through in order to get to what they're looking for. The other thing that I do is I would try to incorporate a lot of the allies and locations that they went to in the first half. So again, the Underdark is very spread out in this adventure, and this second half where you're piecing together this ritual has you going to a lot of places that are very remote, very out of the way, and very far away from the places that you were at in the first half. I would probably get rid of some of that or move them around so it's much closer, and I would tie some of these hooks, tie some of these items to locations they had been to before. This will give the players an opportunity to leverage their allies, or maybe it's a place where they burned all their bridges and they made a bunch of enemies, but now they have to go back into this city and navigate it again in order to get something that they need. How do they do that? I think that could be really interesting as well. So I think it's using a lot of the capital that you generated in the first half of the adventure in the second half. So I think going back to a lot of these locations with new goals and new directives is really great. I think that's a really great way to use a sandbox adventure. So there are probably portions of this second half that I would throw out or add in entirely and rewrite in order to make it the most interesting types of encounters and types of challenges for my players. And then, of course, one of the areas that you may end up having to go to is the Drow city of Menzoberranzan. And there has been so much written on this, and of course we know a lot about the city from the Drizzt novels from R.A. Salvatore, and I grew up with those, so I really love the setting, and I really love the entire race and the lore surrounding it. And the book, Out of the Abyss, doesn't give us a whole lot of the city, so I don't know. I might not end up using that portion of it, or I might try to beef it up a little bit. I think as is, if you're looking for something where you're really going to get into Drow society and Menzoberranzan, you're not going to end up spending as much time there as you are anticipating. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but there are certainly other adventures out there, many from, say, past editions, that delve into the city in much more detail. And the final battle, where the demon lords are all fighting, and then the players may or may not end up fighting against a weakened version of the one remaining demon lord. This is all interesting. I think it misses out a little bit on the opportunity to face the demon lords one-on-one in combat. So by the time you're level 15, if you have an intelligent party of 4 or 5 players and they're all level 15, they're starting to get to the level where they could simply fight one of these demon lords on their own and probably stand a chance of winning. So I think at that point, Wizards missed out on a little bit of an opportunity to create some set piece encounters against the demon lords, rather than just throwing them all together into one maelstrom, having them all eliminate one another, and then having this final encounter against one of the demon lords, but a weakened version of that demon lord. Because when I see these demon lords, and they have full stat blocks for all of them, and they're actually really cool. I love a lot of them, and I used a handful of them. So I used an aspect of Dweeblex and Grazit, who's just a wonderful demon lord. I love using him. He's so intriguing to me. So he played a role in the campaign that I ran. I think there's a missed opportunity to include more of the actual demon lords manipulating or fighting or just in other ways. For the most part, they're kind of in the background, and what the players end up dealing with are things like the fetch quest to form the ritual, which just take them out into the Underdark, or they're dealing with the influence of the demon lords, but not the demon lords themselves. By the time you're level 13, 14, 15, I want to just charge in and take on one of these demon lords. Maybe that's foolhardy, maybe that's not every player, but by the time I'm level 15, there isn't much that I think I can't take. Whether or not I'm right about that, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe the demon lord kills, it's a TPK, and that's the end of everything, but I think that would still be a cool way to go. So your mileage may vary. I don't think the ending is unclimactic. I think it is kind of cool. I just think there are some missed opportunities with some more direct confrontations there. And in past deep dives, particularly the Waterdeep Dragon Heist one, we talked about different like supplements and other things that you could pull into the adventure to make it more complete. And in this one, I actually don't think there's a whole lot that I would need to pull in to make it complete. I think more so with this, it's about curating the content that's in the book in order to find the best stuff and make it work, make it flow at your table. So, which of the locations do you want to spend the most time in and use a lot of the political factions or intrigue or side quests? That sort of thing. Because I think there's so much content in this book that if you tried to run all of it or even 80% of it, you would have a really, really long campaign, and a lot of the time would be spent outside of the main story arc. So in that sense, I don't think there's necessarily more content that you need to pull in. There might be some things that I missed out there that I think that would end up making Out of the Abyss a little bit more complete or a little bit more interesting in some way, but I think the really nice thing about Out of the Abyss is that there are so many ideas, maybe more so than any other book Wizards has come out with in 5th edition, that there's going to be a veritable smorgasbord of things for you to choose from. So really, I think that is the strength of Out of the Abyss. There's just so many good ideas that you can pull in and truncate as you see fit in order to make this work well. Now, the one things, and we did mention both of them a little bit, that I think don't work quite as well are the overarching, so like the pursuit of the drow in the first half, which I don't think works quite as well as the designers had hoped. And also in the second half, when you're doing the quest for the ritual, you are in a lot of different remote locations. Yes, you're dealing with the Demon Lord incursion, but it's in ancillary ways. You're kind of off to the side rather than dealing with it directly. I think there are some missed opportunities there with that main story, but I also think there are so many great encounters and NPCs and ideas in the book that there are a lot of different ways that you can make this interesting. And I also want to mention that I love, love, love that we get full stat blocks and some backstory and lore and history about the Demon Lords themselves. And if you wanted to use one of the Demon Lords in your own homebrew campaign, there's a lot of information on a lot of them parsed out throughout this entire book. So you can see, how does their influence exert itself on a particular region? What types of monsters and enemies and creatures are you going to encounter if you're in an area that's under the influence of a certain demon lord? So I think that's really great. I mentioned I love Grazit, and he's, I think, one of the coolest major villains in all of D&D, and there's a lot of interesting information in here that you could pull out of the Abyss into an entirely different setting, entirely different campaign, and I think that's true of not just all of the demon lords, but a lot of these locations. So, should you get this book? Well, I think on the whole, it's a little unwieldy. So if you're a brand new DM looking for something to run, I would probably say try running something else first. There's going to be a lot more work with Out of the Abyss than some. So Curse of Strahd is going to be easier to run as written. Lost Mine of Phandelver is going to be much easier to run as written. But if you're an experienced DM and you are excited about running an Underdark campaign, I think there is so much here to play off of, to use in a campaign, that if you are passionate about the setting, you're going to be able to find something really cool and your players are going to have a great time. I think the other great way to use this book is to basically what I did is to pull things out of it to throw into your own campaign. So I ran a heavily adapted version of Out of the Abyss without it actually being Out of the Abyss. And there are a lot of adventures where I don't think you could do that. I don't think you could do that with Curse of Strahd, for example. I think the Curse of Strahd is so narratively focused on its main goal and the presence and person of Strahd that it's hard to take elements out of Strahd and put it into a different setting because everything is so tied to the main plotline. Here in Out of the Abyss, there are a bunch of awesome Underdark ideas that aren't necessarily tied much at all to the Demon Lords or the central plot line. So if you're in the Underdark and your story arc, what your players are doing, has nothing to do with Demon Lords, there's still going to be a lot of interesting stuff in here, whether it's the settings, whether, the cities and towns and the Dark Lake, or if it is just some of the cool encounters that it has in there for you to bring the setting to life. So if you are or are going to run something in the Underdark, I would absolutely recommend you pick this up and read through it, even if you're not planning to run Out of the Abyss itself. And that's it for Out of the Abyss. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got some ideas for how to make it work really well and how to make it really fun at your table. If you've run Out of the Abyss, let me know in the comments. Let me know how it went. And until next time, take care.